Welcome back. In this video, we'll continue to look at conditions that can reduce prejudice with Part 2 of Learning Objective 13.5 for PSY 235, Social Psychology. We'll start with a really classic example of a study. I don't know if I would call it an experiment, but it is definitely one of those historical examples of a study that was done by Sharif, a name that should be familiar to you from previous chapters, where he took a group of 12-year-old boys and randomly assigned them to groups, to teams, Eagles and Rattlers. These were, pre-adolescent boys. I'm going to show you the archival footage and then I'll talk about it some more.
Between 1949 and 1954, social psychologist Musafar Sharif and Carolyn Wood Sharif collaborated with graduate students to hold a series of experiments to test one of Dr. Sharif's ideas, known as realistic conflict theory. This having to do with intergroup conflict, stereotypes, and prejudices. The most famous and significant of his experiments took place in 1954 at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. Sharif's main idea was that conflict arises between groups when they're competing for limited resources. This hypothesis had important implications as the Second World War had recently ended. The experiments involved 22 children between the ages of 11 and 12. None of them knew each other previously, and all came from similar backgrounds: middle class, white, and Protestant. The experiment had 3 stages, the first being a bonding stage. Before the two groups were made aware of each other, they were encouraged to bond and create social norms by engaging in activities such as swimming and hiking. Here the groups took names, the Eagles and the Rattlers, and developed their own cultures and cultural norms. The next stage was the competition stage, lasting 4 to 6 days. In this stage, there was to be friction between the groups, and as such, a series of competitions were arranged. These competitions included baseball, tug of war, and touch football, among others. The winners would receive a trophy, medals, and pocket knives. There was no alternative prize for the losers. The Rattlers, who had developed a norm of toughness and aggression, became emphatically confident in their success. They put Rattlers' flags on the baseball field and made threats about bothering them. The researchers then manipulated situations where one group would gain at the cost of the other. What started as verbal aggression between the groups soon escalated further. After one of the baseball games, the Eagles burned the Rattlers' flag. The next day, the Rattlers raided the Eagles' cabin, flipping beds and stealing personal items. Soon, fistfights would break out, and the researchers had to physically separate the children. After the end of the conflict period, where it was announced that the Eagles were the winners, there was a reducing friction period. The groups were asked to characterize the other group, and it was found that there were profoundly negative characterizations, while holding their own group in high esteem. During this time, the two groups were brought together to engage in non-competitive activities. Sharif believed that simple contact between the groups would not reduce friction. Instead, there would need to be common, superordinate goals to accomplish. In one event, the boys were to watch a movie together, but had to chip in money of their own. They worked together to decide the splitting of the money. They also had to work to fix an issue with a water tank and the water supply at camp, which the researchers had arranged. Likewise, one of the trucks delivering food became stuck and had to be pulled out by the children working together. At this point, the kids had come together, no longer as enemies, but as allies with a common goal. Musafar and Carolyn Sharif had successfully demonstrated realistic conflict theory. Normal boys became their own cultures and showed that conflict for limited resources can lead to prejudiced attitudes and discriminatory behaviors. While simple coexistence did not eliminate these prejudices, working together towards something better for both groups did.
So what this study demonstrated, and sorry, and it's not without its critics. Historically, when we go back to these very old experiments and look at them with a more critical lens, some have criticized the methodology and the degree to which the researchers and the graduate student researchers engaged with the kids. Some have suggested that that the behavior of the researchers actually magnified the division between the boys in the different groups and so on. Globally, though, it's still believed to be one of the first successful tests of the realistic conflict theory, and it demonstrates the importance of being able to establish what are called superordinate goals. And superordinate goals are essential for being able to resolve conflicts when there are scarce resources. So this graphic shows kind of what happened in as the study went forward. So when you looked at outcome variables, like the percentage of boys who had a best friend in their outgroup. So, eagles versus rattlers, how many eagles had a best friend who was a rattler, and vice versa. Before there were cooperative activities that had a superordinate goal, you had very low rates on both sides. When you had cooperative activities with superordinate goals, like needing to chip in to have a movie night, needing to solve the problem of the water tank that was broken, then you have significantly more individuals who had best friends across group lines. Now, there is still, a fairly substantial difference here between the rattlers and the eagles. Some of that was explained in terms of the particular cultures that were created within those individual groups, with one of them being a bit more harsh than the other. Regardless, the big differences between these two groups right here, before cooperative activities were introduced, and these two here, after the cooperative activities were introduced. So when we revisit the contact hypothesis, what we realize is that mere contact between groups is absolutely not enough to reduce prejudice, and in fact, it can backfire, creating more opportunities for conflict. And in fact, people, when left to their own devices, may come up with excuses that can create conflict when none existed before. Prejudice has been found when testing these kinds of situations to be decreased when two things happen. When you have groups that have equal status, so if you're talking about kids in a school, for example, there can't be any privilege set out for one group over another group of students in terms of their status within the school. And then the groups have to have a common goal. At that point, you can see people coming together and ignoring the fact that they're in different groups in order to achieve those common goals. One variable that really can enhance the idea of having common goals is when people absolutely depend on each other for their success. In other words, mutual independence, or the need to depend on each other to get to a goal, is really, really important for ensuring that you can actually reduce intergroup conflict through contact. Researchers have identified 6 basic conditions under which contact is going to successfully reduce prejudice. The first is what we just talked about. You have to establish mutual interdependence. You have to put people in a situation where they need each other in order to succeed, in order to bring about an outcome that they desire. You have to give them a common goal that's tangible, that's doable, but only doable if everybody participates. You have to make sure that the parties have equal status with one another. It helps if you can create a less stressful, more informal kind of setting for contact to occur in. So if you put people under a pressure cooker, and you place really intense time demands on them, that's not friendly and it's not informal. It actually can enhance the perception of between group conflict. So you have to make sure that you're constructing, if you want successful contact that's going to reduce prejudice, you need to create that informal kind of friendly atmosphere that feels lower stakes. Then you have to create situations where people will have to get out of their group and get to know multiple outgroup members, preferably in one-to-one interactions. And you also have to, if you're the person who's sort of coordinating these contacts, you have to establish norms of equality on the ground. Remember how social norms play a really important role in determining whether or not prejudice can flourish. You have to, if you're the teacher in the classroom, or if you are the leader in your organization, you have to create and declare and live norms of equality before you can expect people who are against each other or at odds with each other to behave in a way that is more welcoming, that is more respectful and less prejudiced. Now, your lead author, Aronson, is well known for his research into prejudice and discrimination, and also for the creation of a method for creating cooperation and interdependence that he referred to as the jigsaw classroom. With his colleagues, Aronson designed this technique in order to reduce intergroup conflict in K-12 settings. Basically, the jigsaw classroom works like this, and you may have had some experiences like this in your own K-12 classrooms. Students are placed into, ideally, 6-person groups. Why 6? Because if you get higher than 6, it's very hard for people to have meaningful one-on-one interactions with each other. So students are placed in diverse groups, meaning you have members of the various social groupings within the classroom are sprinkled across each of the groups. So in some of the early tests, what Aronson and his colleagues did was they were in schools that were very diverse, but there was still a high degree of segregation within the classroom. So like in some of the Texas schools that they went to, the Latino and Latina students would tend to hang together, the Black students tended to hang together, and the white students tended to hang together. What they do in a jigsaw classroom is to randomly assign people to their 6-person groups so that they are mixed in terms of racial complement. The teacher then provides a lesson that's divided into segments. Each student in each group has to complete the reading of the material for that segment, and then each student has to learn their part, and then they have to teach it to the rest of the members of the group. So they are mutually interdependent. If they're going to be successful in completing the lesson, they have to work together. Each one has to complete their part of the project and then present it to the other members of the group. And by doing so, each of them depends on the other. This dependency tends to reinforce the norm of reliance and interdependency, and it tends to decrease the valuing of competition. Since the norm on the ground is, we're all in this together, we're going to get to the end goal, but we all have to contribute. Through this process, what happened with K-12 kids was that they began to pay more attention to each other's strengths and weaknesses. They wanted to know more about each other. They also showed more respect for each other, and that mutual sort of interdependence tended to breed liking and further interactions. In some cases, the research showed that when you had these jigsaw groups, it often spread to free time that the students had. They would be more comfortable playing with one another or sitting with one another during lunchtime, and so on. So what does the research show? The formal data, and this is, Jigsaw Classroom has been tested and tested again and tested again. The observations of teachers and experimenters tends to be supported by the data. Compared to students in regular classrooms where you have a teacher presenting the lesson, here when you had students in Jigsaw groups, they showed less prejudice, more liking for their group mates, and they also tended to show those behaviors not just in their classroom, but in other contexts as well. There were also trickle-down positive impacts on performance. So the students, regardless of what groups they belonged to, started to perform better academically. They showed boosts in self-esteem, and that was particularly for the students who were in minority groups, but it was seen across the board. And they also tended to like school better. When school is seen as a place where conflict happens, kids tend to learn less well, and they tend to feel more fearful and anxious in their classrooms. In the case of the Jigsaw classroom, it's a place of not competition and not fear. It's a place of collaboration and cooperation. Now, as you might guess, it really you are dependent on doing it right. Jigsaw classrooms are no better than traditional classrooms when they are not properly implemented. So if you're wanting to create children who integrate with one another in a meaningful way, so out on the playground, in the lunchroom, on their school buses, when they're walking home, the teacher needs to be very rigorous in setting the norms for the classroom, very rigorous in ensuring that the students are, in fact, dependent on each other for their mutual success. According to Aronson and his colleagues, the Jigsaw approach, and there are many other forms of classrooms that do similar things. Why does it work? It works because you're participating in cooperative groups. That shifts your attention away from group membership and toward the task at hand. And that allows people to create a new set of relationships where they're talking about these are people who are unique. They each have their own strengths and weaknesses, their own abilities, and we can mutually, as a group, take advantage of all those things. And it can make us all more successful. Anytime people in a group see each other as individuals, they tend to feel closer and more cooperative, especially if there's a superordinate goal driving them. The cooperative strategy also tends to increase the perception of a norm called favor doing. So in a way, it's kind of like the social responsibility norm, where you do nice things for me, like you teach the lesson really well for me to learn your part of the material, I'm going to do the same thing for you. You help me learn, I'm going to help you learn. It's a way of enhancing that social responsibility norm so that people feel honor-bound to participate in the mutual success of their group. It also drives up levels of empathy. So when you are reliant on other people and they are reliant on you, it encourages you to understand how other people are feeling. For example, I can't remember exactly when this research was done, but it was kind of an outgrowth of the Jigsaw approach. But what they were really trying to do was increase the degree to which students in elementary school were welcoming and empathetic in their interactions with students with disabilities of various kinds. So they created, this sort of jigsaw approach where students with disabilities were not separated out into their own room or into a part of the room. They were integrated into work groups where you had able-bodied, non-disabled people mixed with people with various kinds of disabilities in those groups. what happened with the elementary kids, when they were dependent on each other for their success, they started talking about, asking each other, what are you really good at? What do you struggle with? What do you like to do? What don't you like to do? What's your house like? All these little get to know you kinds of questions, but also some questions that inform how can you contribute to the group. Because, without that kind of structure where the norms on the ground are include everyone, and that's a message that comes down from the top, from the teacher, include everyone in the process. Instead, what would often happen is that the disabled child in the group would simply be ignored and everybody else would pick up the slack without even asking. So one of the concrete examples from this study was you had a child who had cerebral palsy who was cognitively intact. They were actually quite a good student, but didn't have very many friends. And when they were in interactions with other students, they tended to be ignored. When they were put into a jigsaw-like group and they had a chance to interact, what the other students recognized very quickly was this was a very bright child who actually was very good at certain aspects of the task that they were working on. So as they were working in their group and performing each of their jigsaw tasks, they saw this person as an equal participant in the group, and that drove up their level of empathy. The researchers noted that the students who had disabilities started to be included in more activities on the playground, including changing the way games were played so that disabled students could be included. So modifying kickball, modifying other kinds of games so that those children could be more actively involved in what was going on the playground. To be involved in that jigsaw classroom and to do it, in a way that's, emotionally satisfying as a participant, you actually have to pay close attention to the other people in the group. So when they have the floor and they're instructing their part of the lesson, you have to look at them. You have to listen to them. And that alone can increase the level of empathy and understanding that we have for other people. Participants, when they're engaged in these kinds of learning dynamics, they have to learn how to approach each of their classmates as a unique individual. As I was saying earlier, getting to know people's strengths and their weaknesses. I do a lot of work with student research groups, and every year when students come together in groups, I don't randomly assign them, but they self-select who they want to work with, but still there's a lot of getting to know one another, getting to know strengths and weaknesses, getting to know interests and abilities, and then using that knowledge in order to maximize the achievement of all members of the group is one of the really nice outgrowths. Now, what we have to do as instructors of our senior research class is really set up the norms on the ground, that you're not in competition with your classmate who's in your group. You are a collaborator with the member of your group. Nobody's going to one-up anyone else. No one gets the rewards. Everybody shares in the outcomes, even when you're being evaluated individually. So to conclude this chapter, your authors talk about other forms of cooperative and interdependent learning structures. Researchers, since the time of the jigsaw classroom, have created lots of different variations on cooperative tasks. There are many, many techniques. The jigsaw classroom is dependent on breaking a lesson up into chunks and having students instruct each other on the various chunks and then evaluating them on the whole thing. There are lots of cooperative strategies. What Aronson and his colleagues have shown is that, through hundreds of replications, children of all ages and in various places can actually benefit from this kind of orientation to cooperative and interdependent learning. In terms of how widespread the use of these tactics is, It really depends on the school system, but it's generally accepted as one of the most impactful ways of improving intergroup interactions. So, employing these methods in a school environment, for example, when you know there's a lot of conflict, or at least the potential for that conflict, using cooperative and interdependent strategies can actually head off some of those conflicts that can become very divisive within a school. So, increasing the degree to which stigmatized people are accepted, such as students with disabilities or people with mental illness. You can build empathy for people who are perceived as the outgroup, such as racial or ethnic minorities. And actually, it just improves instruction. It improves our ability to achieve those learning outcomes that we desperately want to achieve. And that concludes my coverage of Chapter 13.